Right. This is an amendment which is completely irrelevant. But of course, our friends on the other side know that this is an opportunity or an excuse for them to make a bunch of speeches about issues that have nothing to do with this bill. We have 1 and 5 minutes and even 5 and 10-minute opportunities to do that. But it is frankly disrespectful to the members of this committee that you are using a markup on a serious piece of legislation that will really help people so you can pontificate about some of our colleagues. Let's be very clear. I asked the gentleman to yield.
I would ask the gentleman's words be taken down.
I asked the gentleman to yield for a question.
The gentleman has the time.
I asked the gentleman if he would
Not to
yield for a
impugn the
question.
integrity of other members. He doesn't have the time.
I asked the gentleman if he would yield to a question. The question would be, can you tell me if there is a single state in America that is defunding, disbanding, or disestablishing a law enforcement agency of that state? The reason I wanted to ask him that question is because the answer is no. It doesn't happen. And by the way, Democrats are not proposing that. In fact, we have, as Democrats, funded to the police to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in our relief package. And every single one of my Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted against it. So there's one party that's defunded the police, or at least tried to by voting against funding for the police. That are my friends on the other side of the aisle. The Democrats, in fact, have provided substantial resources to the police in a series of pieces of legislation and funding on the floor of this House. And so this is, again, an opportunity, sadly, of my Republican colleagues to raise an issue which they claim Democrats are arguing for, which is not true. But they're using this markup as an opportunity to promote this big lie. The Democrats are funding the police.
That is a violation of the rules. You just lectured on the violation of the rules, and that member is specifically violating the rules and your instruction. Are we going to have rules or not?
It is not a violation of the rule. The gentleman will proceed.
Thank you, Mr.
Well, then
Chairman.
you should withdraw your
Thank you,
instructions
Mr.
for
Chairman.
Mr. Tiffany.
With all due respect, Mr. Goldman, I control the time. And so let's return back to this piece of legislation. I regret that a very important bill that will have a really significant impact on families that we all represent all across this country is being at least temporarily distracted from by this amendment. It's an amendment which is wholly irrelevant. The CARES Act, I'll just remind folks, included $1.25 billion in grant funding for local police for states. Every single one of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted against that funding. So how dare the claim be made in this committee or any place that anyone's trying to defund the police? And again, this amendment says a state that is doing it. There is no state in America where this is happening. This is a make-believe argument to give folks an opportunity to promote this claim, which we know is untrue. It's infuriating. I urge everyone to reject this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
The Democrats have a bill that says to political jurisdictions, if you change your law, if you do it the way we want, you will give you money. And our colleague from North Carolina comes with the amendment and says, if you engage in certain behavior, we're not going to give you that money. It is entirely relevant. The chairman has twice now used the term irrelevant. This is as relevant as it gets. Last week, the Democrats started off the week with one of our colleagues from Detroit saying no more policing. We just heard the gentleman from Rhode Island say the Democrats haven't talked about defunding the police.
No, that's not what I said.
One of their members said last week,
we haven't talked
no
about
more policing. No more policing. And let me just, the Democrat-run cities, New York City cut $1 billion from its police department's budget and saw a 97% increase in shootings. Los Angeles cut $170 million from its budget, saw an 11.6% increase in homicides. Austin, Texas, $150 million cut, 50% spike in homicides. Portland, Oregon, a $12 million cut, eliminated 3 police units. Shootings went up 173%, murders up 25%. I would bet the people, the residents of those communities think this amendment is relevant, for goodness sake. Democrats started the week last week saying, get rid of police. They ended the week with one of our colleagues, Democrat colleagues, being admonished by a judge for the ridiculous things that they said. and somehow the gentleman from North Carolina's amendment's not relevant? Are you kidding me? This is as relevant as it gets, as timely as it gets, and I hope we could actually agree on something and adopt the gentleman's amendment. With that, I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to make it quite clear that this amendment is completely irrelevant. I served as a law enforcement officer for 27 years. It is a tough job, and good police officers deserve your support. You know, it's interesting to see my colleagues on the other side of the aisle support the police when it is politically convenient to do so. Law enforcement officers risk their lives every day. They deserve better, and the American people deserve. I have the floor, Mr. Jordan.
Lady has
What,
the floor.
did I strike a
gentle-
nerve?
the gentle-
Law enforcement
the gentle-
officers
the gentlelady-
deserve better than to be utilized as pawns.
The gentlelady-
And you and your colleagues
gentlelady
should be
will
ashamed
the gentlelady-
of yourself.
The gentlelady will suspend and the clock will be stopped. I want to admonish members. They must not interrupt someone who has the time.
Mr. Chairman, can I
You
ask a
simply
question?
can't shout out. If you think that someone is saying,
I agree.
If you,
Mr. Jordan, you don't know what in the heck
if
you're
you-
talking about.
if
You
you-
know
Yes, I do.
nothing about what law enforcement
I know
officers
about my
do.
motive.
And you're using them as pawns because it serves
Everyone-
your
everyone-
ridiculous political purpose.
Val, everyone must suspend. I am making the point. No one may shout out when someone else has the time. Not Mr. Gomert,
Question, Mr. Chairman.
not Mr. Jordan, nobody.
Not Mr. Cicilline,
Not Miss,
not Ms.
he
Demings,
didn't do that. But nobody,
did.
Not Mr. Jordan.
not,
yeah, not Ms.
No-
Mr.
nobody.
Cicilline. Okay, no, but I agree with that, but I have
And
a
how
question.
do we,
everybody,
I have a
I
question.
will simply, there is no
I got the same
question.
question.
Nobody may shout out.
When you
If
give
you
a
see
speech, Mr. Chairman,
nobody
about
make-
motives and questioning motives, and
This
then our motives are
is
questioned,
emotionally
how do we
charging
address
for
that?
me
The rules
because
allow
I
a
was law
request
enforcement officer.
words
I have
point of
watched them
inquiry.
live and die, and you know nothing about that.
Will we
And to
address-
utilize them as political
Mr. Chairman,
pawns,
I have a point of
pisses me
inquiry.
Off.
People
Chairman,
will
I have a
address
point of
comments to
inquiry.
the chair.
Mr.
The rules
Chairman.
The rules do not permit shouting out when someone else has the time. The only thing you may do when someone else has the time is you may raise a point of order if you think it proper, and the chair will then rule on the
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
So you gave us a lecture on people questioning our motives. When someone questions our motives, how do we address it when they're in the act
That
of
is
questioning
not
our
a
motives?
point of order.
Yes, it is.
That is not a point of
Mr.
order.
Chairman, may I continue, please?
That is not a point of order. Ms. Demings
Parliamentary-
has the time, and the clock will resume. Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to hear that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are on the side of law enforcement now. Because I don't know where my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been over the last 4 years, including on January 6th, when police officers who protect us every day were fighting for their lives because of the big lie that was told, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were silent. As one person after another person took the microphone and said, go down there and engage in combat, fight like hell. They used the bicycle racks as deadly missiles against the law enforcement officers that you all say you care about so much. And thank you, Mr. Cicilline, because you're absolutely right. The only person who voted to support local governments and pass legislation to support local governments that includes law enforcement were the Democratic members on this side of the aisle. But now today, you support law enforcement. Well, I'm delighted to know that. But don't support them when it's politically convenient for you to do so. Support them when they're under attack by people fighting them and spraying them and knocking them to the ground and beating them with poles, with carrying the American flags and pipes.
Unbelievable.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose is Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Appreciate the chairman. I would note that the gentlelady references January 6th. Speaking for myself and at least a few others in this room on this committee, I was one of those members that voted not to object, that took the floor acknowledging some of the issues that occurred on January 6th. And everybody in this room, regardless of how they voted on January 6th, understands exactly what Capitol Police did in standing up and defending this institution. And in fact, just today, the Republican conference presented certificates and awards and commendation to recognize law enforcement that stood on the floor of the Capitol to defend this body. I did not serve in law enforcement, but I was the first Assistant Attorney General of Texas and had about 170 law enforcement reporting to him. I was a former federal prosecutor and worked with law enforcement. My grandfather was the chief of police of a small Texas town. My great-great-grandfather was a Texas Ranger in Texas. I come from a family that is heavily devoted to law enforcement and the rule of law. I understand, and I've heard the arguments that FOP supports this legislation. That's fine. The reason that we're rising and the reason that the gentleman from North Carolina's amendment matters is because what we're talking about nationwide, in response, by the way, to that nobody's cutting anything, that's just not true, is that we are seeing dramatic cuts and attacks on law enforcement. It's happening in real time. Austin, Texas, run by Democrats, slashed the police department, and they are absolutely demoralized. They are crushed. Go talk to the law enforcement. They are fleeing the city. And now the city is overrun by homeless encampments, and it is dangerous, and people don't go downtown, our beautiful city in Austin, Texas, because of a radical leftist city council. And that radical leftist city council takes funding from this body. All of the funding everybody talked about, ooh, you voted against all of that great local government funding. That because you spent $6 trillion in the last year, $6 trillion. We're talking about grants with money we don't even have. We're talking about, and we're arguing about grant money we literally don't have, while we mortgage our children's future and we pretend we're not doing it. $30 trillion of debt. $6 trillion in a year. It cost us $4 trillion in today's dollars to win World War II from beginning to end. And this Democratic Congress blew through $6 trillion in a year doing nothing. Nothing to make this country better or stronger. It is an absolute abomination. And then to listen to members of this body say, and I quote, "I hope we get a verdict that says guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away. We've got to stay on the street. We get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure they know that we mean business." How irresponsible can a member of Congress be than to say that and then to have the judge in the case that the whole nation is watching say that that might throw the case out on appeal? That is what we're talking about. We are talking about the quote by another member of this body. It wasn't an accident. Policing in our country is inherently and intentionally racist. I am done with those who condone government-funded murder. Government-funded murder. No more policing. Quote, no more policing, incarceration, and militarization. It can't be reformed. To say this is irrelevant, it is the central issue of our day right now to make sure this country is safe. And when we're talking about federal grant money being doled out, and by the way, what does the bill start with? Quote, to provide grants to states that do not suspend, revoke, or refuse. That's what we do. We throw out money, and then we demand action. And all my friend from North Carolina is doing is saying, don't defund the cops. I yield to the ranking member.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Republicans have been consistent. The gentlelady from Florida said Republicans care about law enforcement today. We've cared about law enforcement all the time. It's been the Democrats. We condemned the violence on January 6th, and we condemned it last summer. It'd have been nice if our colleagues on the other side had done the same. All last summer, when police were being pelted with frozen water bottles, bricks, and beat up, where were they? They were raising bail money to bail out the rioters and looters who were doing those very actions to the police. And today we get a lecture about how we haven't been consistent? You got to be kidding me. We've been consistent. You guys haven't, and you know it. That's why you're all so fired up. The gentleman's amendment is right on target, and I hope we adopt it. I yield back.
I yield.